John chapter 10, verse 27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. So in the previous part of the passage, Jesus had been comparing himself to a shepherd and comparing his people to sheep. So the first important thing I want to pull out of this verse is that Christians hear the voice of God. So there are some people who might pray and they don't think they hear anything from God. They might be tempted to think, well, God just isn't speaking to me. But this verse plainly says that if you're a sheep, if you belong to Jesus, if you are a Christian, then you will hear God's voice. So it's not a matter if you hear him, but when. If you don't hear God at all, then there might be reason to doubt whether you are a Christian at all, or one of Jesus' sheep. So it's good to keep that in mind. But also, another option is sometimes we're deaf of hearing. So even as Christians, God may be speaking to us, but we just don't recognize or hear him. So I want to also point out, hearing God doesn't make you a Christian, but you can't be one without hearing God. So it is a mark of a Christian to hear God, but just because you hear God doesn't make you a Christian. Otherwise, Balaam would have been one of God's favorites too, but he wasn't. And then secondly, it says here, and they follow me. So Jesus' sheep not only hear his voice, but they also follow his directions and apply it to life. So why does God speak to us? This is the second question I had. And first of all, the very simple answer is because he's real. So if you're a Hindu or a Muslim or belong to some other religion and pray to either a statue or some imaginary God in the sky, he doesn't speak to you because it doesn't exist. But God exists, and therefore he does speak to us. Now, there are people in those religions who do hear voices, but that could mean either that they're crazy or being demonized, both of which I could give a lot of examples of. But the second reason God speaks to us is because he loves us, and he also has a mission for us in life that he wants to communicate. So obviously, in order to get us to accomplish the mission he has to communicate with us through speaking. Now, how does God speak is the third question I have here. Remember our verse, my sheep hear my voice and I know them and they follow me. How does God speak to us? Obviously, the first thing we should say as Christians is he speaks to us through Scripture. And I'm sure all of us have experienced those times where we've read a verse 1,000 times, and then the 1,001st time, we have like what's called a rhema by some Bible teachers, or a verse that just sticks out so much you're like, wow, I never saw that before, and it was there the whole time. That's happened to me a number of times. Has that ever happened to any of you? Yes. We'll see some hands. Okay, good. And secondly, God speaks through other people. Thirdly, he speaks through dreams, or I should just throw in visions and audible voices, all sorts of supernatural means. So, for me, I have heard God speak in dreams, and I'm sure some of you have too. Usually they're in the form of a parable, and when I wake up, I'm either perplexed about it and pray, and then God gives me the meaning of it, or the meaning just hits me, and I'm like, oh, that's what it means. But occasionally, God has spoken in a way that without parables, or very little parables to me. And just one quick example was when I was with the circuit riders on a missions trip. One night, they said, we want all of you as a team to pray about your futures, and just pray, what does God have for you? And so in the middle of the night, I had a random dream, and I hadn't even thought about my prayer after praying. I just prayed it and went to bed. And in the middle of the night, I had a dream where I saw like a mile marker off in the distance, and it was kind of hazy off in the distance, and as I was walking towards it, I got so close that I could put my hand on like the stone. And suddenly I heard a voice above me in the sky that said, this is your future, and as you approach it, it will become more clear and tangible. And when I woke up a second later, I was like, God just spoke to me. It made me so excited. And so dreams is definitely one way that God can speak. And lastly, God can speak in audible voices. We hear that in Scripture. God sometimes said, here is my beloved Son, listen to him. You might remember that Scripture, where the disciples heard God's voice like thunder from the sky. And then, of course, God speaks in visions, which, when I break it down, there's probably two types of visions. One is you could just close your eyes and see like a picture in your mind, and that's a type of vision, maybe a lower level type of vision. But also God does give open-eyed visions to people like John, for instance, when he wrote the book of Revelations. And I just mentioned levels briefly, so I just want to touch on that. It's interesting, I'm just going to read you Numbers 12:6. And he said, he being God, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak to him face to face, even plainly, and not in a dark saying. So there are levels wherewith God speaks to people, and one of the lower levels apparently is like a dream. I hate to use the word levels, but I don't know of a better word. He speaks in dreams, but to those prophets that are very close to God, he'll speak face to face. So last question, concluding question. How do we hear from God or from Jesus better as Christians? And obviously, the first step is, and if you haven't done this, you need to do this, give your heart and life to Jesus completely. But if you have done that, we should be careful to turn our focus from the world and from its busyness to God. So leave aside the world and busyness, take a quiet time like Jesus went up on the mountaintops and prayed with God for long periods of time. So we need to do that. Also, be holy. If you want the opposite example of being holy, King Saul, disobeyed God, and then a little bit after that, he was complaining. He's like, God doesn't speak to me in dreams anymore. He doesn't speak to me in visions. He doesn't speak to me through the Urim or the Thummim or from any other means. He's like, and then he went to a witch to try to hear from God. So being holy is important to hearing God's voice, although there are some unholy people who have heard God too. So I won't leave it out. And then spending time in prayer is also very important. If you expect God to speak to you, you should speak to him because he likes conversation. After all, he's a living God. We just talked about that earlier. So this is not a formula. It's just some tips because God is not a machine. He is a being, and he can choose to speak whenever he wants to.